Eggs, the podcast featuring the best and brightest minds in business leadership, entrepreneurship, and technology. Today, we're breaking into the digital landscape of social impact with Eric Ressler, the founder and creative director at Cosmic, a trailblazing social impact creative agency. Eric stands at the forefront of innovation, where technology meets social good, steering organizations through the currents of the attention economy to make a real-world splash. On this week's show, we'll learn how a digital-first approach can empower social change, the secrets to engaging a digital audience with compelling narratives, why acting like a digital media company can be a game changer for social impact leaders, and so much more. Please join us in welcoming to the show, Eric Ressler. Hey, Eric, how are you, man? Welcome to the show.
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thrilled to have you. So we talked a little bit at the top there about kind of who you are and what you do, but let's talk a little bit deeper about that, kind of like maybe the longer story version of how you got to what you're doing.
Sure. So I'm the founder and creative director at Cosmic. We're a social impact creative agency. So we work primarily with nonprofits, B Corps, social enterprises, some governments and funders as well, basically the social impact sector as a whole. And we help them really kind of nail their impact story, build brand awareness, inspire action. We do that through strategy, design, and technology. So we have a team of about 9 folks, and our discipline kind of matches that type of work. We're completely distributed at this point. We used to have an office downtown in Santa Cruz where I'm still based. And now we have a team across all 3 time zones in the US and a client base that's international.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, it's funny because we started to dip into it a little bit before this, but how, even though you guys have niched into social impact, the skills that you guys have to possess in order to do that effectively would translate into, standard businesses or any company trying to sell any product. And what I think is particularly interesting about it is I think that there's a seriousness that comes with social impact because you're really purpose driven and you're really trying to push an idea or a, methodology or an ideology, whatever it is. And I don't think a lot of business owners think of their marketing or their presence like that. I think they think, oh, well, I've got to move this widget or whatever, but it doesn't maybe come from as deep a place as if you're trying to do something with social impact. But if you viewed your standard marketing exercises, with the same sort of energy that you do social impact, I think you could actually be a great marketer. So maybe talk about your experience a little bit with that and how you see sort of parallels or differences, in the way people market.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at it kind of in that reverse way because we actually started doing branding and design and marketing for a lot of startup organizations and not particularly the social impact space. And we did that for about 7 years as an agency and then chose to kind of specialize in the social impact sector. What I find interesting is that there are a lot of fundamentals that translate across both kind of, markets, so to speak. 80% of it, maybe 70% of it, somewhere in that range that's just like best practice for branding and marketing and digital storytelling. And then there's, that last little, 20 to 30% that is a little bit different, specific to social impact compared to selling a product or a service. Now, sometimes in the social impact space, you are selling a product or a service, but oftentimes you're selling an idea about the future. And that's a little different to kind of tell that story, to sell that, so we think about it more as instead of having customers, you have a community that you're reaching and that you're engaging. And they may also be customers at times, or they may be donors, or they may be volunteers, or they may be advocates. But we look at it more through that lens of really building a movement or a coalition of supporters and advocates, and how you engage those people over time in a meaningful and authentic way, I think is a little bit different than, if you're really just kind of marketing a particular product to a particular audience.
So, you obviously pivoted into the social impact world. What was the clientele that kind of made that happen? There had to be an aha moment, oh, this is what I was supposed to do. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you realized that and then how you made that pivot?
Yeah, so it was really a strategic choice for us as an agency. We'd been around for about 7 years. We'd grown really kind of almost effortlessly and organically, both in terms of size and revenue up to that point. And then we reached that 7-year point and we were essentially starting to kind of plateau in both regards. We weren't getting any bigger. We were feeling a little stuck, or we were kind of spinning in place. And I think what we realized, with the help of, advisors, is that we needed a more meaningful differentiation for Cosmic outside of just our expertise around branding and design and technology. And so we looked at different ways to essentially like reposition the organization. And pretty quickly we realized we didn't want to go all in on just like one discipline, because that like kind of like horizontal positioning, as it's called, is just not suited to the way that we like to do our work. We like to work a little bit more holistically, full service. And so that means we need to kind of instead focus on a particular like niche or sector or industry. We started looking at all these different options and putting options on the table, looking at our past work, looking at the work that we had done that was the most fulfilling and the most successful, and eventually kind of landed on this sector that we call the social impact sector. It's referred to in different ways. We kind of started to like describe it in all these different ways. Oh, we want to do like community-based work or like people-based work. And what we realized is like it needs to actually be a sector that we can market to, that we can build deep expertise around, where we can start to see patterns by doing similar work for similar types of organizations, and be meaningfully different when we serve them over just a generalist agency.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting about that too, because even if you look, all the way up the chain at the big dogs like the Ogilvies and the, Gray and some of these other huge agencies, like so many of them really are that generalist model. And so I think for a lot of like small agencies, younger people who maybe are starting up or spinning up a little agency, things like that, it's really hard to sort of look at that sort of niched approach to finding your sector or having the confidence to pick a sector, I guess. And, so you see a lot of these kids model themselves after these bigger agencies where they just kind of will take all comers. And all you hear from every professional is that you ought to be niching down into something, right? But almost nobody's brave enough to do it. So I applaud you for doing it. But maybe can you elaborate a little bit more on just sort of like making that decision? Was it clear that it was going to be social impact from the jump? Like, was this something your team happened to unify around, or was there some other niche that you looked at?
Yeah, we explored others. It wasn't clear right away. And it was definitely probably the hardest business decision we've ever had to make. And it wasn't easy. And I can kind of speak a little bit to the transition. I do think it's something that I had been hearing from advisors and professionals for years. Oh, you got to niche down, you got to niche down. And I think we were always reluctant to do it, because by niching down, you're essentially saying no to a lot of opportunities coming your way. And you do have to do that at a certain point. What we ended up doing is, after we kind of had made the choice, we spent some time thinking about how we could like remessage, reposition. We did a lot of research. We actually hired an agency to do some research for us to just kind of understand some of the fundamentals of like market size and potential and that kind of stuff, because we knew that it was really, we're placing a pretty big bet by doing this, and we wanted to make sure that it could pencil out. And so I think that if you're an organization thinking about like niching down, you do need to kind of do some of those projections, do some research, and make sure that there's a viable market there. There needs to be enough buyers out there, a big enough marketplace out there to actually buy what you're selling for any kind of positioning to work. And some of that has to be trial and error, but I think some of it can also be, doing some research, whether that's kind of qualitative or quantitative research, whether you do that on your own or you hire an agency like we did to help do some of that research. So, the transition was, from a marketing standpoint, very instant. One day we launched a new version of our website, and we had our very clear positioning out there about who we were serving and how we served them that was focused on the social impact sector. Practically, it didn't happen overnight for a couple of reasons. One, we didn't have enough opportunities at first to just only serve the social impact sector. It takes some time to build out that brand awareness within a new sector. And so naturally, like some opportunities coming our way were already in that space. We already served a number of clients in this space, which allowed us to kind of like vet that, yes, we can do this. It's viable. It's meaningful. We can make an impact for these clients. I think that's all really important. But we also had a bunch of legacy clients that we were already engaged with that were coming back to us for new work. And we didn't just, say no to those people either, that we had longstanding relationships with. So the marketing transition can be instant, but the practical transition will and should take a little bit of time. And that can kind of help you bridge that gap of, saying no to a lot of things. Eventually we did start to get enough opportunities in our new niche that we were able to start to say no, mostly to new opportunities, but even sometimes to old clients who were coming back, 5 years later, who wanted some work done that really wasn't appropriate for us anymore, either because they weren't in the niche or because what they're asking for wasn't really our focus as an agency. So the transitions happened, over time. Every once in a while, we'll still take on a project that's outside of that niche. That's either an old client or just like a really cool project that's a creative opportunity or a learning opportunity for us that we feel like is still worthwhile, that still aligns with our value system, that's not, doesn't work against that, but isn't strictly who we're trying to reach. So you always have that choice as an agency to, to kind of figure out who you put on your client roster, regardless of what your marketing is. However, if you are serious about trying to niche down, the benefit of niching down is you're building true expertise, and that's different and that's meaningful. And in order to do that, you have to actually do the hard work of pattern matching, like looking at a bunch of different organizations, like the lived experience of helping enough of them to start to see some of the trends around their challenges and opportunities, and build out expertise that, helps them in a way that a generalist firm couldn't.
So when most people talk about niching down, they're going from, like, oh, I did websites and I do video work and I do flyer design, I do all this other thing. And a lot of people are like, hey, you should niche down and just do web work, or you should niche down and just do this. By niching down into the social impact part of it, it still kind of almost sounds like you're still taking all types of projects, but with a social impact flair to it. Is that kind of what I'm getting out of the equation?
No, you're right. I mean, I think we still have, although we're holistic in the work that we do, we still only do certain parts, right? So we're a creative agency. We're not, we're not attorneys, for example, right? So like we have, there's other professional firms there's many other professional firms that serve this sector from a different vantage point or through a different lens. When I say we're holistic, we're a creative shop in the sense that we can help with, all the way from strategy through some of that foundational branding work that needs to be done. So branding, messaging, positioning, all of that, through implementation of digital experiences. That's really our sweet spot. So building out websites, building out strategies for digital campaigns, those kind of things. We used to do full service photo and video production, and that's something we actually have kind of dropped out over time because although we really enjoyed it, and we have a lot of people on the team who come from a professional photo and video background, went to film school, for example, it's just really hard to run those types of projects at the same time or in parallel with some of the other types of projects that we do, simply from a logistics standpoint, like being out on shoots, all day long, sometimes really long days. And then we're kind of not available for other types of work for other clients. It was just becoming kind of too hard to manage that as a small team of 9. If we had our own little production shop within Cosmic that was like another team of 6 to 9 folks, that's all they did, that would be viable, but we don't have that. So we've chosen instead to kind of really play the agency role in those kind of productions. We can still handle that for clients, but we bring on different production companies to do the actual shoot days and post-production and that kind of stuff. So we still have like a collection of services or different service categories that all work together holistically. Clients don't always want to have 5 or 6 different agencies doing all the different parts, and then they have to wrangle and make sure it's cohesive. So although we're a team of 9, we usually kind of serve as like the agency of record for our clients, even though that term and that approach is not as in vogue as it was even 5 or 10 years ago. Clients come to us essentially to be kind of a one-stop shop for most of their needs, and then we can bring on individual consultants or niche agencies for other parts as needed.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to hear you say that. I mean, there are a lot of parallels between what you guys are doing and what we do in our agency, which is a lot of that sort of agency type behavior where we've become the center hub and we just do all the booking instead of people having, several different agencies. So it's funny how it's evolved because my background's in creative direction, art direction. And so the doing all this like booking people, we've actually started calling ourselves a virtual agency for that reason. Like we're basically just a team of baseball cards and you put us together for whatever project we have, so it's kind of, kind of interesting because there's a lot of parallels between what you're saying and what we do also. And of course, though, we've always struggled with this problem, just in transparency, we've always struggled with this concept of niching down and trying to be a little bit more of or less of a generalist and more of a, specialized shop. And by virtue of the type of clients we've picked up, we've ended up sort of specializing, but it's probably not the niche that we'd have picked, right? Just by virtue of the work that came in, it made sense to kind of go that direction. But we're still kind of a take all comers shop, right? So I really appreciate that, what you've done. And I think people underappreciate how difficult it is to move into a position like that. So let's talk about then. So you guys have committed, you've decided to turn the corner. We're now a social impact shop. You go and you seek out some work in that genre and you finally land somebody. Like, was there anything, the imposter syndromes, any of these kinds of challenges that you encountered, in this first client? Hey, now we're selling ourselves as a social impact shop. We got a social impact client. Now can we actually do it?
For us, we didn't really have any extra imposter syndrome. I think like everyone has some amount of imposter syndrome at any given time. I mean, for me, I feel like it ebbs and flows. There's times where I'm like, especially after doing this for 13 years professionally, it's like, I've picked up a thing or two and I have strong opinions around how things should happen. And then you see, some other shop put something out or whatever it is that kind of triggers that imposter syndrome, or like a client asks a really tough question that you feel like you should be able to answer, but you can't, or you have a project that isn't as successful as you hoped that it would be. And then that imposter syndrome just kind of like rears its ugly head again. Right. So I feel like for me, it's just kind of like a whack-a-mole thing. It always pops up and you have to just like trust that you're doing good work and you're doing your best and work through it. When we made the transition, there wasn't any extra imposter syndrome in the context of any given client relationship because we'd already served many clients in the sector before successfully. So we knew we could do it. We knew we had the, general base expertise to do it. I think the imposter syndrome showed up more at like a meta level of like, questioning, like at times, certainly questioning, like, was this the right choice? Like, is this sector viable? Like, have we painted ourselves into a corner? What opportunities are we missing out on by having this positioning? I don't even know the answer to any of those questions truly because we haven't A/B tested our decision, right? We didn't run a parallel test where we didn't do this. Where would we be today? I have no idea. All I know is where we are based on the choices that we've made. The sector is, a very crowded sector. More and more agencies are jumping into social impact as their kind of like calling and their positioning in as it kind of threads out from that. So the space is getting very noisy and very saturated. Like, would I recommend doing it today? Probably not, unless you could niche down even further. We're lucky in that we got in like kind of early enough that we've been able to carve out some brand reputation within the space through a lot of, consistent marketing and, getting out there and publishing over the last 5 years or so. So we're getting, good results because of that. It'd be a lot harder to break in if we made the choice today. So I think we're seeing like a huge trend in agencies as everyone's trying to kind of find purpose in work, realizing like, hey, we can like make this choice. And that's largely, what drove our decision to some degree is our internal team wanting to do meaningful work. Everyone wants to do meaningful work. And so, the imposter syndrome has been more at like a meta level of like, have we learned enough to say that we have, specific expertise through this positioning, through pattern matching, doing all of this? The answer is like, absolutely yes. But again, there's times where it feels like there's always more to learn. You learn something from a new client or a tough question comes in and you get that imposter syndrome kind of popping back up again. But it's less, for me at least, less about any particular project feeling scared that we're not going to deliver, and more about just like the meta choice and making sure that we're constantly kind of evolving and growing as a team.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So now that you're, waist deep in this stuff, and this is where you spend your time, having seen the other side of the coin where it was just sort of traditional marketing, can you talk about things that are specific or unique to social impact marketing versus your traditional marketing?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like a whole set of specific challenges and specific considerations. And some of it is about the end user experience, and some of it is about just like how the sector operates. So like the sector as a whole operates in kind of a different way. It's really kind of its own entire economy, separate from, traditional like, business economy in certain ways. So the way funding flows, for example, especially in the nonprofit space, like a lot of these organizations are funded through a combination of grants and gifts instead of revenue. Some nonprofits, or many nonprofits, actually have some source of revenue through, oftentimes consulting, even sometimes like selling products or services, but they have this kind of like mixed revenue. So marketing and sales and revenue are all, like, as you guys know, like very closely intertwined. So when any of those things is meaningfully different, the entire equation changes just by the nature of that, right? So we're looking at KPIs and, conversions around donations, fundraising campaign success, all of that kind of stuff versus, but not only that, and we'll get to some other examples as well, versus just like cost of goods sold or like, baseline revenue for the year. Especially when we're working with organizations that are more about, building movements like grassroots movements or coalitions. Like sometimes the KPIs are not even at all about revenue, but they're about getting a bill passed, for example, something like more political, or like reaching a very small group of decision makers in a meaningful way that have the ability to kind of enact change politically or culturally. So that just, that's a very different goal that we're reverse designing or engineering towards versus just straight, building up more revenue for the organization. I think also this idea around sometimes these organizations are really just trying to change culture and not, the idea of something, of a potential better future for humanity. One thing that's really difficult about this work for us and for our clients is that oftentimes the issues that they're working to solve are literally the hardest issues in the world to solve. They are the most intractable issues in the world. We're talking about like income inequality, like housing, food insecurity, just as some examples. These are problems that have existed for millennia and possibly may never be fully solved. We're just working towards improving them. And so that can be inspiring. It can be challenging. It can be, it can lead to like emotional burnout at times, especially for our clients. We're lucky that like we don't, at the end of the day, it's not our job to fully solve these issues. Whereas for some of our clients, it kind of is their job to work towards that. And so we look at our impact from the lens of like, by us being involved, have we multiplied our clients' impact? Have we made their work better in a meaningful way that we can kind of measure, or at least get some anecdotal data around that kind of supports that our work helped them? And I think that's sometimes hard to measure. It's actually often hard to measure when you think about what's the ROI of like a rebrand, for example. That can take years to fully mature, if not decades, the value of doing a rebrand and like repositioning and remessaging. So it's like you're not going to see results necessarily that are fully reflective within even the first year of that exercise. So it's kind of hard to even sometimes get the sense of like how effective was our work. Other parts are much more clear if we're looking at things like engagement and like site traffic and donations and those kind of things, much easier to measure, but not holistic of the benefit of doing the work. So it's interesting to just kind of like play in all of these murky waters and know that the work is valuable and worthwhile. And when we get even anecdotal stories of success, sometimes that can be so much more impactful even than looking at metrics that are impressive.
Yeah. Social movements can be tricky, especially in this political climate. And everything that's going on in the world right now, even a topic like homelessness, like you mentioned, or medicinal marijuana, or something like that. You have a giant population who love it and a giant population who are completely against it. The messaging and branding has to be really on point to be able to be effective and not stir the hornet's nest. You know what I mean? I was wearing a Carhartt jacket the other day, and someone came up to me and like, I used to love Carhartt, and then they went woke, and I was like, what? Carhartt woke? What are you talking about? Right. And so, how do you thread that needle? How do you kind of like stay on both sides and not piss off a whole group of people and then ignore the actual meaningful content?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a nuanced question these days because everything is so polarized. We actually have a couple clients in this kind of like depolarization space, which is really, I think, something we as an organization value highly, because I think it's so important that we depolarize, especially in America. But this is obviously not just an American problem. So, I mean, the short answer is we craft messaging appropriate to the audience that our clients are trying to reach. So sometimes our clients are trying to reach, a particular political leaning, for example, and we're not like, we don't do, for example, like, political campaigns for elected officials. Like, we're not going to like help someone, become a state senator, for example. Like, that's not our focus. There are agencies that do that help run political campaigns. We made a very conscious choice not to do that because we like sleeping partially. Those kind of agencies are just like on call 24/7. And so, we work a 4-day work week. Like, that would just never work, right? If we tried to tell a, political candidate, oh, we're off Fridays, they'd be like, no, we're 24/7, right? So even just logistically, that wouldn't have lined up. I think it really comes down to, like, sometimes you're going to piss people off with your messaging, and that's just kind of the cost of doing business, so to speak. Because the near enemy of that I think is even worse is trying to appeal to everyone, and then you appeal to no one because your messaging is just so weak and watered down. Now, can you do that in a way that is respectful of people who disagree with your opinion? Yes. And I think that's something that we always strive for. It's something you don't see a lot in the political campaigns that are out there and political marketing that's happening, which is all essentially identity politics at this point, just trying to, rile up your base, usually with negative fear-based marketing. That's something we strongly disagree with, because even though it does work in the short term, we don't believe that the trade-offs long-term are worth it. And so even if we're working on, issues that are political, which is essentially pretty much any issue in existence today, with the exception of maybe a very small select few, we're trying to always do it respectfully. And we're trying to do it in a way that it's bold, but it's honest and it's positive. And we're talking about the potential for a better future instead of trying to just like fear monger or, play sides or, pull other people down who disagree with the opinion of the organization that we're supporting.
Yeah. I like the polarization, the A or the B, or the picking sides. Everyone's kind of, it's this way or that way now, and that you can't just kind of meet in the middle. And I think the idea of meeting in the middle and that kind of mindset is pretty much where you need to be, especially in someone in your position. So
yeah, I think through the internet and the way that we communicate online and not in person, kind of we lose the nuance. Like, everything becomes kind of black and white, and there's so many reasons for that through the digital media landscape and social media platforms and all of that. I think it's a disgrace. Like, I think there's a lot more common ground than we realize, and certainly, if any one of us sit down with anyone else, we're all going to have some level of disagreement of opinions. But I think when we can't meet in good faith and have disagreements respectfully, that's where things start to get really dangerous.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you touched on some of these elements moments ago in your conversation, but I wondered if we could talk a little bit more about the way that we do digital storytelling for social impact versus, the way that a normal company might be doing, their messaging. And one of the things that occurs to me, and it was something that you mentioned earlier, is kind of the length of the view here. So you mentioned that you're doing work, for a company that is really looking at the future. Like, how do we make things better for people, not today, not tomorrow, maybe not in a year, maybe not in 10 years, but we're way down here. Where if I've got a widget and I'm trying to sell some widget, like, it's not important to me if they buy it in 10 years. I need them to buy it this year for revenue's sake. So I wonder if you talk a little bit about just, the strategy behind having to kind of play that longer view with some people in terms of, I guess, identifying what's most important. Like, how do you know where to begin when you've got a 10-year story to tell?
Yeah. So I think oftentimes what we see is clients come to us and they say, hey, we're having trouble telling our story in a meaningful way. And there's usually not just one reason why that's a problem. And so we have to kind of put on almost like a hat of curiosity, or like a detective hat, and like start to dig deeper around like, well, first of all, like, what is it that you actually do as an organization? Because oftentimes that's not even clear in organizations' messaging, because they're trying to do this like compelling, emotionally driven storytelling, and they may be somewhat succeeding at that, but at the expense of clarity around like, well, what's the actual impact you have in the world, and what are you doing today, and what's your vision for a better future? So we have to, as an agency, deeply understand that before we can come back with any kind of strategic or creative solution or set of solutions to present to our clients. So we do a lot of research and digging and understanding of that. Sometimes that means even, conducting surveys or doing interviews or focus groups or whatever it is to get that understanding. Oftentimes it's interviewing kind of like key stakeholders or decision makers at the organization or department heads or whatever it is that can give us that understanding that we can get up to speed as quickly as possible. Usually what we see is that organizations feel like they need to tell their story through their marketing. And what they really need to tell is a story about how supporters can get involved in the movement that they're building or the change that they're trying to create. So they spend a lot of time kind of talking about themselves. And that's important. Like, we need that content, we need that story, but it shouldn't necessarily be the main story. The main story really needs to be like, what are the opportunities for you as a supporter to get involved today? And then we can give them the opportunity to dig in deeper, especially over time, maybe not right away, to understand the origin story of the organization, which might be, relevant. Oftentimes these organizations, because they're doing this intractable work, they see how all the systems are broken in different ways, and they start to kind of build up all these different programs over time. And then they have 10 programs that are all doing kind of slightly different things, all, sort of like connected, but it's not clear. So there's this like really tangled mess of a story. It's like, oh, well, we do a lot of different things and we serve a lot of different audiences. And so, of course, it's really hard to have a cohesive, impactful story when you're trying to tell basically like 10 stories of 10 different types of audiences at once. So a lot of times we help them with kind of the hierarchy of that story and like developing different targeted messaging for different target audiences and figuring out how to kind of prioritize those in situations like the website, where like you kind of really need to have a main story on the homepage, right? You can't have 10 all at once. And so it's it's nuanced, and there's different reasons why, organizations struggle with that. But I would say in the social impact sector, that's a really big one. A lot of these organizations are doing a lot of work for a lot of different groups. Sometimes we actually help them cut some of that out and help them, the language we use in the social impact space is finding their niche in the social impact ecosystem. Oftentimes there's 10, 20, 100 organizations focused on the same issue as one of our clients. So how are they any meaningfully different from other folks in the space? And they're not really competitors in the same way that they would be in like a normal like B2B or B2C situation, but they are still competing for dollars to some degree. They're competing for mind share, right? So we look at them really more as partners. And so what we recommend to clients is like figuring out what are their unique strengths as an organization. Oftentimes that taps back into the origin story. How are they meaningfully different in their approach or their focus, and like really helping them kind of hone in on that message as a starting point.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So,
go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I was going to say you're kind of like no, you're all good. You're kind of more into tech and digital experience and that kind of world. Where do you see the future of the digital experience in the upcoming years, and how is it going to impact our culture and in that? I mean, everyone's social now. You got your Snapchat, your Instagram, your TikTok thing. Are you kind of going down those trends, or is there something else that's coming up?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, I think, particularly right now, because I personally feel like the internet is in a weird, like, tween, like, puberty stage. Like, the early internet is no longer where everything was just, like, free and open and kind of this big social experiment. And now it's being, even we're watching it with, like, the streaming wars and, like, consolidation. We're joking today as a team that, like, oftentimes new tech and startups will come in with, like, a really awesome disruptive thing, and they come in to try and kind of like fix some industry or some problem. And at first they kind of do, and then they like displace what was there before. And then ultimately it just kind of comes back to just a worse version of what they were improving in the first place. If you look at Uber or Airbnb as like examples, or even like WeWork now declaring bankruptcy this week. It's just like these startups come to try and like kind of fix a problem. Maybe we didn't even know we had a problem. Maybe was there even one? I'm not sure. And then at first it's kind of better for the consumer. And then as those organizations come in and they're like, oh, we actually have to be profitable, it turns out they start charging just as much, or, whatever it is. So, that's in the kind of startup world. When it comes to how we connect as people through digital channels, that's a really interesting question. Like, I think we're all starting to realize that there are pros and cons to how we're communicating and connecting as humans today. And, obviously the pandemic and the lockdowns really like supercharged digital transformation, and more things are happening virtually. For example, this podcast that's being recorded completely virtually, 20 years ago, we would have sat down in a radio station and done this, right? That's awesome in certain ways, and that's great. So there's all these like really cool benefits to technological progress and the internet empowering that. But then we're also seeing all these downsides too. We're talking about polarization. I would say largely the internet is responsible for that. If you look at any kind of like culture war that's happening and being proliferated online, if you got those same people to sit down in a room together and talk about it respectfully, the outcomes may be quite different. So what I'm personally seeing is people are looking and yearning for human connection that's like never going away. That's just built into us psychologically, physiologically. Like, we need that as human species, right? And so how can the internet and how can digital channels do that as skillfully as possible without, hurting our cultural progress or our sustainability as a culture? And I think what I'm starting to see personally is a lot more like niche communities, like people leaving some of the bigger platforms, or maybe like they're still on there, but they don't care as much about them, and kind of like circling around like topics or interest areas, or like micro communities around something that they care deeply about, and forging more meaningful long-term relationships there. So how will that pan out in the long term? I don't know. But I hope that we can kind of regain some of that early, like experimental, creative spirit of the early internet that seems to be lost more and more these days.
Yeah, and it's funny too. There's so much slop in technology too around, as you alluded to, this idea of just this whack-a-mole of solving problems, real or imagined. And so from a digital marketing standpoint, I have to imagine that there's sort of, I know that we personally get bombarded with the latest, greatest, thing that they've bolted AI onto. And, so I wonder, are you guys finding that you're going back to, specifically if you're trying to really foster, real relationships, do you find that you're spending more time on like fundamental things versus chasing down the latest tech?
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I think that's always been kind of in our ethos as an organization. So, for example, like, we're huge believers in the power of your website and the power of your email. Some of the oldest channels, but your owned channels, right? That you don't have to worry about a billionaire coming in and buying your like strategy on Twitter, and then all of a sudden, half the user base is gone or whatever. So I think, social media is an important element of your strategy. A lot of decisions and relationships start on social, but people still, as they start to understand more about your brand and they want to learn more, they do want to engage with you outside of those channels as well. They want to be able to go deeper on your website, or, having like a little bit more of a distributed strategy where you don't go all in only on one channel, but you pick a couple that are really well suited. We're seeing a lot more organizations literally building their own communities on platforms like Circle, or, there's others out there as well where they can kind of build their own. Discord obviously is huge as well for that, in a more kind of real-time way. And that's where I'm kind of coming from this more like niche community versus like everyone just being on kind of like the big channels. Now, of course, a lot of people still use Facebook. A lot of people still use Instagram, Snapchat too, right? The TikTok is obviously like kind of the main channel, especially for younger audiences right now. But these things ebb and flow. And so you have to figure out as an organization how to kind of skillfully play in some of these distribution channels, but at the same time, like, have your own house in order. Don't forget about your own channels, because those you have the most control over. And over time, those are going to kind of like weather the storm of the, the social media ebbs and flows as they come.
Yeah, that makes sense. You almost have to sit back and look at your client and look at the demographic that you need and then pick the platform accordingly. But having your own email campaign and your own website, and your own Discord community, that kind of like that weatherproofs the system, so when the storms hit, you still have that to fall back on.
Yeah, I think a little bit about it is sort of like what I might call like the Apple approach, which is Apple has all this core fundamental technology. They've got good reputation. The materials or the equipment they build are going to be good, things like that. But with a lot of technologies, they're almost the last to adopt them. So when it comes to facial recognition or thumbprint recognition or any of these other things they've done, they kind of always wait until it's perfect and then roll it out as if it's new, even though Samsung did it 3 years ago or whatever. And so, but because they've got their sort of fundamentals of this house in order, the Apple has this reputation for great hardware. And even though we all know they're dragging a little bit, we know it'll be right when it gets here, except Apple Maps. And, but there's basically, I think that this model, it takes a little bit of bravery to do it, because I think the impulse, maybe just as humans, is to seek out the new and novel. So we try and chase down each one of these platforms. Threads is hot for a week, whatever it is, we're kind of chasing all these different things. But at the end of the day, the fundamental stuff is really what it is. And it's funny because you see those parallels like in the life you live, in the relationships you have with friends, in, literally every aspect of your life. The simpler version of it, the one where you're not chasing the biggest, best, next, whatever, is always the best one. It's the happiest version. It's the easiest life. It's the best, it's just, everything seems to work that way. So it's funny that we're constantly battling it.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. And I think especially for clients in the social impact space, they don't usually have as much capacity. They might not even have like even a 3 or 4 person marketing team. It might just be one person who's responsible for managing all of their channels, right? So it's like you have to figure out what's the best ROI as an organization. And I think honestly, like getting that core owned media, your website, your email, getting that right is really step one and foundational, because that's really going to kind of set the stage for everything else. You bring up Apple as an example. They're a great example for a number of different use cases, but I think what Apple's done very successful, and they continue to be successful at it, is, really strong brand building, which is something that's been a little bit less in vogue than it used to be. I think especially because of the internet and, advertising and marketing going much more analytical in nature and more scientific to some degree. But what we're starting to see, especially with some of the enhanced kind of like tracking protection that I think is rightfully being rolled out, it's a little harder to kind of track attribution for, leads or visitors or purchases or whatever it is. So brands are kind of having to go back to some of these more, weatherproofed, tried and true strategies. Which is kind of funny to just see it come full circle, like asking how you heard about us in a sale instead of just like looking at, all the metrics that come through or the analytics that come through. So I think that's just another sign that, building a solid brand, which takes, time and energy and consistency and integrity as an organization, is ultimately the best strategy. But it's the long game, right? It's not the short game. It's not going to have that, that same impact as like, lining up with the release of a new social platform and getting a bunch of followers there right away. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to kind of weigh all the options as a leader within an organization and make sure that you're playing the short game, reasonably well, but also not losing sight of the long game.
Yeah. And speaking of short game, I just wanted to mention things like all the sort of the shift in marketing to this concept that things need to be short and bite-sized, right? Because we flip so quick and we're going through Reels and we're going through TikToks and, as if that this is the way that things are meant to be, right? Obviously almost nothing works that way. If you look at podcasts and stuff like that, the biggest podcasts in the world are hours and hours long, right? People really do want long form content. I understand that there's a place for this bite-sized stuff, but if you notice, most of it's not particularly useful. It might be entertaining or give you that little dopamine hit, but like how much can you really learn in 1 second, in a 1 minute YouTube short, for example? Like you just can't gain enough, So I understand part of it is playing the game. We must do this thing because this is how we maybe get some eyeballs or get some additional engagement. But I think that in especially in the social impact space, but also just in sort of traditional marketing, I mean, vanity metrics like likes and views and stuff, like, I mean, some of it's just kind of not that important, especially when it pertains to this like quick bite-sized, kind of content.
Yeah, I think it's so true. And I love the term vanity metrics, and I use that all the time because I think it's like there's this kind of culture being instilled into us around like being able to measure ROI of this work. And I think that that's important to a degree, but you have to be realistic around that too, because you are naturally going to measure what is the easiest thing to measure, which is these vanity metrics, like whether it's on social, like likes and engagement, or if we're talking about like paid media, like cost per conversion or cost per acquisition and some of these things. And we've worked with consultants and agencies who have helped us with that. And we're like, that's great. Like we've, reduced our, our cost of conversion down 1%. How many more new business leads did we get that month? Like how many of those deals actually closed? Like those are the metrics that actually matter to us. And there's a lot more than just any one ad that's going to lead to something like that happening or not. And so I think we actually also see this in the social impact space in a kind of weird parallel way, where nonprofits especially are often measured by their overhead percentage, like how much of their funding goes directly, quote unquote, to the program work, as if like they don't need infrastructure and overhead to run a sustainable business. We know that everyone needs that. And there's a good balance, right? There's obviously too much overhead that can happen. We see that a lot in, large corporations where CEOs are getting paid 500 times or more what the average employee is. Like that's obviously not a right balance either. But if you think about a company like Apple saying, 90% of our revenue goes directly to like, building the products, you'd be like, what are you doing? Like, where's your investment in marketing and branding and research and development and, infrastructure for your team? Like all these things are important for a healthy, sustainable organization. But the easy thing to measure is overhead. So we say, oh, well, this nonprofit who, only 10% of their budget is overhead and 90% goes directly to program work, they must be better than the one that's, 30-70. But then if you start to dig deeper and look at, well, how many people did those different nonprofits reach? Oh, it turns out the second one reached 1 million people and the first one only reached 100,000 or whatever. Well, who's actually the more effective organization, right? So it's like these vanity metrics are not just around marketing. They actually go all the way through like evaluation and like evaluating the impact of an organization too.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's that Sarah McLachlan commercial in the arms with the animals?
ASPCA, I think.
Yeah, whatever. We don't even need to throw names out there, but I actually looked up one of those like ad campaigns and the overall support behind it, and you realize that 90% of their actual budget is going to generate more commercials to get more phone calls coming in to, instead of actually helping the animal or
right.
Helping the kid in Africa that you're taking on, that to me, seems wrong. It's like
right. Out of balance in the other way, right?
Yeah, because you can go, you obviously need to get the word out there, so you need a marketing campaign. But if you're putting 90% of your revenue into just getting another phone call and another subscriber instead of actually helping the matter or thing that you're trying to help, it's really you're kind of in a hard spot to be like, because you need this, but you don't need that, but you need to kind of thread that needle. And so I really appreciate what you're doing and the kind of work that you're doing. So
yeah, it's definitely a delicate balance or a needle that you're trying to thread, because you don't want too much money going into overhead. I think really what it comes down to is like, are the investments that you're making, whether it's marketing or branding or in your own team or in your office, are they helping to support a meaningful impact in the end goal of what you're doing? And you need to be able to say yes to that without hesitating for it to be a good decision.
Yeah, I think that's right. So one of the things I want to try and get into real quick before we wrap up here is I want to talk about the sort of, I mean, we talked a little bit about it earlier, but sort of this nuanced difference between the way that normal companies or, traditional companies do their marketing versus the way that like a nonprofit or a social impact company might do it. But I think for traditional businesses, there's a lot of opportunity to learn something from this space. And I think we sort of alluded to it at the beginning, but this concept of maybe putting a little bit more weight on the marketing we're doing, right? It's, we're not just trying to move a widget mindlessly. Rather, we would rather move that widget, with a specific customer in mind, or maybe with, maybe we do kind of want to do some kind of social impact through the product we're selling, or, whatever it is. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this concept of finding purpose in the marketing we're doing. We talked about it in the frame of, finding purpose at work and finding purpose in all this stuff. But I think for a lot of people, especially jaded folks that work in companies that maybe they don't love, and they're pitching a product that maybe they don't totally love or believe in, and they're just kind of moving a thing, or, or maybe senior leadership in marketing that maybe doesn't totally buy what they're selling or something. How would you encourage a company? And, you guys might have a unique advantage of having people come to you with a purpose in mind now, but in the past that was probably less common. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just deriving purpose from what we're doing, and then how we might layer that onto the marketing we're doing.
Totally. I think a couple of things. There's definitely, obviously, a huge movement into kind of purpose-driven work, finding purpose in work, moving companies to be more purpose-driven in their work. I generally support all of that. I also think sometimes the purpose of a company is good enough just doing what they do really well, the best that they can, and helping people in the way that they already do. And they don't necessarily need to get into the broader cultural work that's happening. It's a little controversial to even say that because of, so much advocacy around like organizations playing a role. I think there's a time and a place for that. I also think it's perfectly acceptable for an organization to be really good at making a product that helps people in whatever way that it is, and focusing on doing that extremely well. The first step, I would say, if you're trying to be more purpose-driven as an organization, is looking at how are you doing that and getting your own house in order first. Are you doing that in a sustainable way? Are you being humane in your treatment to your employees or whoever is like sourcing or creating some of the raw materials if you're building something that's physical in nature? So are you being ethical in your own business practices? If you're not doing that, then you kind of don't have anything meaningful to say about what other people are doing in the world, in my opinion. Like, you have to be able to say, we're doing our part internally first. That's kind of step one to me. And it's not to say you can't parallel path some of that, but you look at, organizations like ExxonMobil, who are literally ruining the planet and running cause marketing campaigns at the same time. I don't think that's okay. So I think that's, if you really want to try and find purpose in your work as a business leader, before you start looking outside your organization, look within your own organization and look at how you can make meaningful improvements there. If you're stuck at an organization as a marketer, maybe you're not at you don't have enough influence to actually make meaningful change at your organization, but you just want to find more purpose in your own work. I mean, marketing is such a complex and interesting equation that you never are going to solve. So if you can approach it from a lens of curiosity and like looking at this really complex problem and trying to kind of figure out how to make improvements, that might help. It can sometimes be very frustrating because it is so hard to measure. Like, one of the biggest questions in marketing is like, is it working? And sometimes the answer is, I don't know, right? Like, I hope so. So you kind of have to approach it through the lens of experimentation. There is no, silver bullet marketing playbook that works for everyone in the same way. So even like looking at how other organizations are successful in their marketing, that same playbook applied to your organization might be a complete flop. So there's so many like nuanced complexities into what makes marketing effective that you really are going to have to kind of crack that nut on your own for your own organization. It often starts with like, is the organization even positioned well in the first place? If your organization isn't positioned well, if you're trying to sell something and there's no market there, no amount of marketing is going to make up for that, right? So it's like, there's so many different elements to it. But if you are in a leadership position, you're trying to find more purpose in your work, I would say start by looking internally, then figure out how you can make meaningful difference outside of your organization. And if you're stuck doing something within an organization, find a way to like build meaning in by being curious.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it's also awesome that sort of maybe for the third time, we've landed on a full circle where we've also stumbled on the thing that actually makes us the best people. is when we kind of get our own crap together and stop pointing at everybody else for their issues, right? And I think that a lot of people suffer from sort of this cognitive dissonance thing where it's like, hey, it's because that guy is doing that over there that it's an issue for our company. We'd be doing way better if it wasn't for that. When in reality, they're not even looking at themselves. They're just pushing that off, right? Maybe it's a fear thing or a, whatever it is, but for whatever reason, we're not going to address our issues at home. Rather, we're going to try and fix those problems over there. And basically it's kind of a smoke and mirrors kind of thing. And I think a lot of marketers kind of walk through life that way, which is, we don't need to fix the widget. The widget's fine. Like it's that guy. Like if he didn't have that thing going on, then we could sell more widgets, when in reality, maybe you need a different widget, but you don't know because you're not spending any of that time at home. So I think it's interesting because I suspect, and it's funny. So we call our agency a relationship brand or a brand relationship consultancy. And the concept is that basically we're trying to build better relationships between, the businesses that we work for and the people that they do business with. And, but, so even though we're not necessarily social impact, there's a big parallel between what we do and what you're doing in that at the end of the day, it's really about sort of human relationships and it's how we interface with people. And I think a lot of people are turning the corner on that, and that's becoming a little bit more popular, this concept of, real life communication. And, it's hard to avoid the distraction of the shiny new objects and things like that in an attempt to try and get eyeballs. But I think at the end of the day, we're going to keep coming back to this concept that's sort of fundamental, which is just, look at yourself, handle your business, and all the way down to the marketing channels you choose, choose the ones you own, choose the, reach out to the audiences, push your expertise where you actually have expertise, all these things that really start with you at the middle. So I think that's really an interesting learning from all this.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, I think so much of it, like we are as humans, we're so good at picking up on these little nuances. I think oftentimes organizations kind of think that they're kind of fooling people in whatever way they are. And people can generally see through it. Obviously there's exceptions to that and people can get scammed or whatever. But for the most part, especially over time, we're pretty good at kind of sniffing out BS as consumers more and more today, especially with the internet where, there's infinite paper trails on everything that happens, so to speak. So I think like leaning into authenticity in every way as you show up as people and as an organization, even if you might take a couple of hits on the short game, like the long game is going to pay off so much more. And, we see this even with every brand, every major brand taking some kind of position on every kind of like cultural hot topic. And I mean, really, I think in certain ways, this is a good sign because what it means is consumers want to support organizations that are doing good and not wrecking the planet or exploiting people. Obviously, really great. But in the meantime, what's happening is a lot of big brands are saying, okay, well, we're going to come out with this like cause marketing campaign that shows that like we're cool or we're woke or whatever it is. But they're not actually like doing anything meaningful. They're just like virtue signaling through these cause marketing campaigns. So I think it's like, I am absolutely for purpose in business and holding corporations and businesses more accountable to being sustainable in every sense of the word and not exploiting people, not exploiting our planet to do what they do, looking for more sustainable approaches to everything, whether it's energy or production of anything, and consumers kind of demanding more of that. All I'm saying is like, don't BS it. If you're going to do it, you better be real about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's becoming increasingly important. As you mentioned, I mean, there is a paper trail now. Like if you're not practicing what you're preaching, we'll see it. And, and I think that's really important. In fact, it's a big part of why I sort of stepped out of, traditional agencies and things like that is I started to get an inkling that a lot of advertising that we were doing was really kind of manipulative and pushing people into making decisions. And it is that by nature, right? I mean, it is what it is. It wasn't like they were selling bad products or anything. So it wasn't like some evil company, but it was just, but I didn't like that whole manipulative thing. Like I want people to come to things that they actually care about, not that they got kind of tricked into. So anyway,
right.
so
I think that's advertising is persuasion, right? In one way or another. And I think that there's an ethical way to do that and a less ethical way to do that. Certainly. I think very grateful to be able to work for organizations that I can feel really good about persuading people to care about and support in an ethical way. I imagine it's much harder, especially we've never taken on work that we couldn't get behind as an organization. It's just we just can't do it. Culturally, it just hasn't ever been a fit. Our best work happens when we care deeply about the work that we're doing, of course. But, there's folks out there having to sell stuff they don't believe in. And, I don't judge people who are doing that if they have to do it to make ends meet, right? Like a lot of folks are out there struggling right now. Sometimes you just got to hold your nose and get by. So
Right.
I don't mean this at all in a judgmental way, but I can say you sleep a lot better at night if you believe in the stuff that you're selling.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to that whole, if you believe in what you're doing, or if you love what you're doing, right, you're not really doing work. Like, you're having a good time, but you're pushing this thing. And yeah, as a byproduct, maybe we make some income off of it. But at the same time, it's much easier to do that, right? You're not, pushing some concept uphill all the time. Like, instead, this is something that actually brings us joy, and we like it. So I think that's great.
Yep.
And probably a good place to wrap up. So as we sort of get here to the end, Eric, do you just want to kind of leave some people with some plugs where they can track you down if they're interested in learning more about you or Cosmic? And yeah.
Yeah, true to the advice, the website is the home base for us. So designbycosmic.com. We have, a bunch of case studies of our work out there if you're just kind of interested to see how some of this comes into practice. We also publish a bunch of articles and white papers and podcasts like this on our site. We have an insights tab. We released a manifesto a couple of years ago that there's a digital experience for, but also an audio only version called The Revolution is Digital. You can search for that on any of your podcatchers and it'll show up there as a VO that I did for that if you prefer to consume content that way. But really, designbycosmic.com is the home base. You can find everything else from there.
Awesome. Well, and I'll just note that you guys have a really cool website. It's beautiful. So
Awesome.
I really like yours.
Right?
It's funny because actually I think I remember all the way back when you initially booked with us, and I think it's been some time since then. I looked up the website then, and just being a guy that works in the industry, I was like, ooh, this is nice. I really like it. So I am impressed by the work you do, and I think everybody ought to check it out. So that's designbycosmic.com. And thanks so much, Eric. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely. And thanks so much to everybody who tunes into the show this week and every week. And we'll see you guys next time.